Welcome to Theology Matters, and thank you all for coming out this evening. Tonight, our guest speaker is Father Nguyen. He's a colleague from Creighton University, a Jesuit. He's been at Creighton for 5 years. His areas of specialization are mysticism and discernment, and he recently has published or submitted his manuscript that will be published probably next fall on Alpha Delta. So it's my pleasure to introduce Father Nguyen. The title of his talk this evening is All Things Hidden Shall Be Revealed, How to Make Sense of the Sanctity of John Paul II in Light of the Sex Abuse Crisis. Please welcome Father Nguyen.
And offered this insufficient response. John Paul II was one of my heroes growing up in the 80s and 90s. But I became disappointed when I learned that he failed to respond appropriately to the church's sex abuse scandals. His legacy in this issue takes away from the heroic things he did. I paused, and then I added, yet the saints, the holy ones, are not such because of their heroic deeds, but by the grace of God. I then went on to point out that John Paul was accused of hindering the investigation of the disgraced founder of the Legionary Christ, Marcel Maciel Delgado. Toward the end of the discussion, I thanked my student for the question because it clarified the aim of my course, which did not involve constructing hagiographies of saints, but investigating the theology and spirituality of saints as embedded in their history. The former idealizes and adulates the person at the expense of their full humanity. By treating their heroic deeds with a picture-like manner, we overlook how God's grace works with them. To explore the complex history of their witness and writings, we encounter a vision of sanctity that does not ignore sin and its consequences. Thus, in my talk this evening, I attempt to cast light on the sins and moral evil of John Paul II while recognizing his sanctity. I do so with caution and hope, aware that the problematic history of this chapter of church is not quite written, and I trust that under God's providence, all things hidden will be revealed. My talk involves 4 sections. The first explains the meaning of canonization. The second briefly lays out John Paul II's heroic witness. The third, drawn from the theology of Bernard Lonergan, I explicate John Paul's complicity in the sex abuse crisis. The fourth lays out the principles of redemption regarding clerical sex abuse crisis. Okay? The grammar of canonization, or making a saint. Before we get to discussion of John Paul, we need to discuss or consider 3 things. Firstly, as I've already alluded, any number of saints were failures in their task, sometimes quite miserably, and yet they persevered in heroic virtue to the end, which is what contributes to their sanctity. Moreover, saints, including and especially persons who have significantly sinned, are such because of God's grace. In a very few figures, God is teaching us this lesson. Second, the making of a saint arguably is an infallible act, an act of the whole church, reserved to the Roman Pontiff, but an act of the church nonetheless. That said, what does this infallibility mean regarding making a saint? Well, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, and I quote, "The dogma of the saints are to be venerated and invoked as set forth in the Profession of Faith of Trent, as its correlative the Church's power to canonize." Then the entry goes into quotes in Thomas Aquinas, who says, "The honor we show the saints is a certain profession of faith by which we believe in their glory, and it is to believe piously that even in this judgment the church is not able to err. So, in this respect, making a saint, canonization, conveys that the person is in heaven. Accordingly, it is impossible for the church to err in its judgment. Canonization also conveys that the person in heaven lived a heroic life of virtue for their state in life and is to be emulated. This aspect of making a saint is a prudential judgment and subject to possible error. As theologian Karl Rahner wrote, in the reality we live in, sin and apostasy are possible among saints, though the church as a whole cannot fall away from the love and truth of God. As such, when the church honors a pope, are they proclaiming that such an individual was a perfect pastor, or that their period of ministry was one of unqualified success and prosperity for the church? No, this is not the case at all. There are any number of saintly bishops and popes whose tenure damaged sections of the church. St. Peter Celestine was a weak and ineffectual pope, but he was supposedly a saintly man. His papacy was a disaster. Supposedly Dante accuses Celestine of cowardice and puts him in the antechamber of hell, in the Inferno. Yet he was canonized for his sanctity mere decades after his death. Likewise, there are many popes whose papacies were successes in strengthening the church, who have not yet received the recognition of canonization, like Pope Leo XIII. Leo XIII is praised for his defining the Catholic response and position regarding the upheaval of the modern world. As such, one can argue that most popes who have been canonized have been raised to the altar, despite their records of governance, not because of them. JP2 is no exception. Thirdly, all things hidden shall be revealed. Christians have nothing to fear from the truth, for we've been called by name and drawn the waters of Christ's own death into the inner life of God's truth. Put simply, Christ's church will never be destroyed and will never fall away from him. We should not be afraid to name, engage, and confront the sins and moral evils within our church. So, the crisis of clerical sex abuse and the episcopal cover-up in which the church is currently embroiled, one in which includes Pope John Paul II record of leadership, cannot be allowed to escape scrutiny or be spared the most rigorous criticism. The case of John Paul II's heroic witness. The church tells me that Pope John Paul is a saint in heaven. I believe her, and I give thanks to God for the gift of his intercession. I give thanks for his embraced heroic witness. JP's role in the collapse of European communism is now generally recognized as a heroic witness. I first remember seeing JP2 on my family's black and white TV in 1980, wherein he confronted the Polish military who were imposing martial law on its people, who were clamoring for democracy. Before being named Pope as priest and bishop in Krakow, he applied a culture-first strategy against communist effort to rewrite Poland's history and redefine Poland's culture. His efforts to nurture and inform intelligent Catholic laity were examples of what a later generation would call building a civil society, and thus laying the groundwork for a resistance movement with political traction. As Pope, he shaped the politics of East Central Europe in the 80s as pastor, evangelist, and witness to human rights. John Paul II not only confronted communism deep amidst the Cold War, he criticized the principles of free market capitalism. Most importantly, at least for me, John Paul II contributed to the restored dialogue between Judaism and Christianity. The pontiff devoted much of his papacy to reconciliation between two religions and their beliefs. By confronting one of civilization's longest and most tragic conflicts, he built bridges of respect and understanding, fostering a historic rapprochement between Catholicism and Judaism. Also, I must mention that John Paul II reached out to other major religions throughout his pontificate, starting in 1986 in this Interfaith Summit in Assisi, Italy, an initiative he repeated in 86 and 2002. The group in 86 included rabbis, Sikhs, Muslims, the Dalai Lama. Amongst the Christian denominations, there are Anglicans, Orthodox bishops, and Alan Bizek, the South African anti-apartheid activist and president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. And one cannot forget John Paul II's forgiveness of Mehmet Ali Akka, the man who attempted to assassinate him. The act of forgiveness led to a friendship and Mehmet's conversion to Christianity. Overall, his witness to the world in defending human rights against totalitarian communism and building bridges between Catholicism and Judaism and other religions are models of justice and reconciliation. Nevertheless, I strongly suspect it will not prove to have been because of his leadership regarding the Sanctity scandals, but in spite of them, that the divine providence has seen fit to honor him so. If John Paul II poorly handled the crisis of clerical sexual abuse, it is necessary to recognize this crisis preceded him. Christian Charity recommends that as we survey the ravaged landscape of ecclesial leadership in the Catholic Church, we also examine the roots of this crisis, which goes back to several decades. As early as the 1940s, the American bishops in the Vatican were appraised of the futility of any attempt to cure pedophiles. Father Gerald Fitzgerald, the founder of the Congregation for the Servants of Paraclete, a religious order dedicated to caring for and rebuilding struggling and wayward priests, principally those suffering from alcoholism and other addictions, also treated pedophiles at the beginning of this congregation's ministry. Fitzgerald quickly became convinced that the cure was impossible and spent more than 20 years explaining to church leaders the nature of the predilection and impossibility of treating men who had it. In 1957, he wrote to the Archbishop Edwin Byrne of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the archdiocese in which the Paracletes had their flagship facility, saying, and I quote, "Experience has taught us that these men are too dangerous to the children of the parish and neighborhood for us to be justified in receiving them there." Close quote. In 1962, Fitzgerald wrote to the Holy Office, which had asked him of his opinion on the matter, and he said, and I quote, "We feel strongly that such unfortunate priests should be given the alternative of a retired life within the protection of a monastery walls or complete laicization." He said, I quote, and Father Fitzgerald also met with Pope Paul VI shortly after the latter's election in '63 to discuss the same matter, telling Paul VI in a letter after a meeting, and I quote, "I am not sanguine of the return of priests to active duty who have been addicted to immoral practices, especially sins with the young." Close quote. Nonetheless, even Fitzgerald had a blind spot, and I quote, "The needs of the church must be taken into consideration, and an accusation of priests who have seemingly recovered in this field may be considered, but it's only recommended where careful guidance and supervision is possible." Fitzgerald went on to write, "Where there is indication of incorrigibility because of the tremendous scandal given, I would most earnestly recommend total laicization." Close quote. The needs of the church. So, Christ established his church as a hierarchy, so with bishops and priests sharing governance of her. But bishops and priests are not the church, and here we are closer to the problem. One can argue We can move all the predators out of the priesthood and into jail cells, and there would still be a crisis of moral culture in the clergy, high and low, almost as bad as it was the day before the purge. That is, arguably speaking, because the motor of clerical culture we have right now, and this is true perhaps across the board, top to bottom, without respect to ideological leanings or theological inclination, is clericalism. Pope Francis, I think, is right to attribute the evils that beset the church to clericalism. Yet, what does that mean? So at this point, I draw from the insight gained from 20th century Canadian Jesuit theologian Bernard Lonergan, who explains the traditional categories of sin and moral evil in terms of bias, which is an inauthentic orientation caused by and causal of inauthentic actions, decisions, judgments, ideas, and experiences. They are the cause of sin and further sin. The clericalism that Pope Francis condemns is not a bias of individuals, but of a group. According to Bernard Lonergan, group bias involves an incomplete development of common sense and disregards reciprocity implied by the golden rule. Common sense is the accumulation on a social scale of the natural human tendency towards questioning, answering, testing, and collaboration that leads to a dynamic, continually growing public store of knowledge. As such, the community of the Catholic Church has a common sense, a common fund of insights, general storehouse of intellectual tools developed over time by theologians, philosophers, saints, and mystics. However, there are subgroups in the Catholic community which has their own additional particular common sense that comes from their particular context in which its members tend to live and operate. From living together, working together, or sharing a trait that makes them encounter the world in a similar way, people can form many healthy types of communal bonds. But group bias, as in the case of clericalism, is an aberration of common sense that creates what? A loyalty to one's own group matched by an indifference or a disregard to other groups. It is this inability to find solidarity with other groups, as when bishops and religious superiors incline to protect the hierarchy and institute church at the expense of everyone else, that constitutes the group bias of clericalism. Thus, throughout his current pontificate, Pope Francis has targeted clericalism as an illness in the church, an ailment that pretends the church to mean just priests and bishops, that ignores or minimizes the God-given grace and talents of lay people, and that emphasizes the authority of clerics over their obligation of service. Clericalism, Francis said in 2016, is the result of a mistaken way of living out the ecclesiology proposed by Vatican II, which forgets that the visibility and the sacramentality of the church belong to all people, to the people of God, and not just to an elected few. To return to Lonergan here, the Canadian Jesuit does not find social classes within a broader community necessarily bad. Ideally, these groups would arise from and be distinguished by their roles in the ongoing life and mission of the broader community. So, for example, in the Catholic Church, bishops are distinguished from ordinary clergy, laity from religious, and so on. In a group bias of clericalism, the ordained takes advantage of the social order for its own good to the detriment of others. The consecrated life becomes distinguished not merely by their social mission, but also by power and privilege. It leads to a privilege in the area of areas of life where privilege is unmerited or unjust. As such, Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse issued its report in December 2017 after 5 years of hearings and investigation. And it concluded that, and I quote, Clericalism is at the center of a tightly interconnected cluster of contributing factors to abuse within the Catholic Church. Clericalism is linked, and I quote, to a sense of entitlement, superiority, and exclusion, and abuse of power, the report said. So, return to John Paul II. In March 1993, a group of American bishops met with John Paul to request greater autonomy and expediency under canon law to kick out child molesters from the priesthood. John Paul refused, and he said, "My dear bishops, I lived all those years under communism, and I am not about to let that come into the church." So, to make sense of that statement, one must recall that JP2, as Karol Wojtyła, was the leader of the opposition to the Communist Party for 2 decades. Under his leadership, the church in Poland was unified, supposedly, under the direction of its bishops and priests, in judging in an accelerated way to expel bad priests as akin to a totalitarian regime, trampling on clerical rights. John Paul II effectively favored the status of clerics over the status of victims. The abuse of children is a moral lapse that can be forgiven and not a punishable crime. Priests could sin, but could pick up and carry on. In the case of Martial Maciel, the defrocked founder of the traditional religious order, the Legionaries of Christ, and a serial sex abuser, a different underside of clericalism emerged. Reports of abuse committed by Maciel began to surface in public in the 1990s. There are also 2 personal letters accusing Maciel of abuse sent by ex-legionary priests in 1978 and 1989 to John Paul II. He did not respond. John Paul viewed Maciel's Legionaries of Christ as a knightly religious order embodying a resurgent, robust church. Maciel pitched the Legionaries of Christ as the church's response to Catholics who were concerned about the growth of Protestant evangelicals and who were uneasy with liberation theology. In 1994, John Paul II praised Maciel as an efficacious guide for youth. All that said, the case of John Paul II's passivity in light of substantial rumors concerning Maciel would be described as a dramatic bias. For Bernard Lonergan, the moral evil of dramatic bias operates mainly on a subconscious level. It negatively affects the psychic activity of the person. This, Bernard Lonergan calls a flight from understanding. When a person does something wrong or sees something wrong, he may be inclined to remain in darkness and flee from understanding. The flight from understanding is a flight from the natural desire for truth, goodness, and justice. To avoid an uneasy conscience, one may tell oneself more or less conscious lies. That is, one may rationalize wrongdoing. The flight from understanding, performed enough, comes to affect a person not only in his conscious levels, shaping his decisions, judgments, insight, and experience. It penetrates deep into the hidden depths of one's subconscious self, forming a mostly unconscious bias. Arguably, both John Paul II's praise of Maciel and his refusal to grant American bishops more freedom to expel abusers from the rank of priesthood can be seen under the light of dramatic bias. As Pope, his refusal to release priests from their vows reflected John Paul's view that a man, when he becomes a priest, changes ontologically. His very being is made anew. Again, it is if John Paul told himself that priests could sin, but pick up and carry on. It is if John Paul II one of the inspirators for the Second Vatican Council's most pastoral document, Gaudium et Spes, and rationalized to himself that bishops and priests, no matter what crimes they have committed, are indispensable to the church because they constitute the church. He did not want to believe in the idea of a criminal sexual underground in the clerical state. Ultimately, John Paul II was operating from group bias and dramatic bias concerning clergy sexual abuse that even affected Father Fitzgerald. For me, as I look at this, at the foundation of the sins and moral evil of clericalism is dramatic bias. A hierarchy that suffers from dramatic bias concerning the ordained state of life can rationalize its importance and suppress further questions concerning crimes committed by its members. It can share disregard for any reciprocity implied before the rule between groups of people. For Lonergan, the cumulative effects of dramatic and group biases can cause a phenomenon known as a shorter cycle decline. A short cycle of decline is caused by group bias and dramatic bias, where one group's success comes at the expense of other groups. In the case of the Church's sex abuse crisis, the hierarchy rationalized to keep criminal priests at the cost of the laity, younger priests, seminaries, and other religions. Suggestions that would clean and protect the body of Christ were ignored or dismissed by the hierarchy. But there is hope. Lonergan states the short cycle decline caused by group bias creates principles for its own reversal. In its growing power and abuse of power, the successful group calls into being an opposed group egoism. Imperfect ideas and sinful choices that are forced upon a society may go unrecognized as such, except perhaps by a few experts. In a polarized American Catholic Church, I like to tell Catholics who are traditional that one of the first groups that publicly called out these crimes were reporters in the progressive newspaper, National Catholic Reporter. Their reports in the 1990s on the clergy sexual abuse scandal, the hierarchy's denial, were increasingly brought to light for all. Now, one can see the concern, the anger toward the hierarchy from all quarters or different quarters of the Catholic body. The desire for justice becomes the motivation to reform the Church's responses to clerical sexual abuse. Conclusion. So, please allow me to end with 4 guiding principles for hope and reform from another Lonergan scholar, or actually from a Lonergan scholar, Cynthia Crysdale. The first 2 principles concern the full humanization of both victims and perpetrators. The latter 2 principles, the need for a redemptive community and the rejection of scapegoating, underpin the first 2. Firstly, those who are victims must be allowed to see themselves as humans. For victims, redemption entails recovery of human dignity in communion with others and God. For Cynthia Crysdale, this is an ethic of risk because the goal is to create new conditions whereby transformation of selves may take place. Redemption in this case is not repentance of sin, but the acceptance of vulnerability, of telling one's story in the name of what? Life-affirming dignity. Telling stories can restructure the meaning of their lives to reject the rules of domination and objectification by which the perpetrator operates. Persons entering into the death of old meanings to claim themselves as fully humans. Living into a new set of meanings requires a community that supports the rejection of the older meanings and to help discern a new set of meanings. This community does not have to be entirely new. It can build upon the past and help to rewrite a new story. Certainly, honest storytelling and listening are the heart of this community. And ethic of risk here becomes an ethic of solidarity. Secondly, this is where it becomes difficult. Redemption requires grappling with the humanity of the abuser and those who enable the abuse. The abuser and hierarchy must take responsibility for their actions or inactions. Again, such an approach involves an ethic of risk, wherein the perpetrators and enablers must be open to discover the nature of their sins and take responsibility for their oppressive actions. Moreover, the confessions of sins and repentance occur within a community. Only out of such recognition of one's complicity in abuse and the hierarchy generally enter into the grieving and suffering of others. Such compassion may demand concrete recompense or retribution, but these actions will emerge from an honest standing with others as opposed to dismissing another's claims. Thirdly, since Christian redemption is a corporate event, there is a need for a community that works to reverse the cycle of decline caused by clerical sexual abuse. Such community guides its members towards healing and forgiveness. It should entail a collaborative group that holds the hierarchy accountable with stern resolve. Yet, and this is difficult, such a community cannot control the outcome. It can only facilitate the sermon toward redemption, because redemption ultimately is a reliance on God's grace. Fourthly, redemption rejects a type of projection of evil onto another that justifies the destruction of the other. Scapegoating perpetrates rather than ends the cycle of violence and victimization. Overall, the thing that I would stress in my conclusion is that, yes, John Paul II is in heaven. That said, that does not excuse or mitigate his dereliction of duty when he was here. What happens on earth in history matters. There are always playing out matters of eternal life and eternal death in this world. That is the hopeful note, even in this unholy mess, especially this unholy mess. God is always offering us chances to reform and sanctify our church. Thank you.
Can I invite questions that are questions? If you want to make comments, we'll start with questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Hi.
Okay, Tom, please.
Thank you very much, Father Peter, for your talk. That was really insightful and helpful. I think you touched on a crucial point about clericalism. And while you were talking, I was Googling USCCB and clericalism. Nothing came up.
Really?
Which is really interesting. Some individual bishops have addressed it, Supich being
Sure.
one of them, or cardinals. But as a body, there seems to be inattention to that. And I think part of clericalism, this is getting to a question, I think part of clericalism originates in terms, what? Oh, should I use the microphone? Okay, all right.
We have old ears.
Okay, sorry about that. Is that okay, I think part of clericalism is structural and it originates to a certain extent. It's complex, obviously, but in the seminaries. Do you see any changes, awareness, development from your own perspective about how seminaries, or if seminaries, are addressing this culture of clericalism?
That's a great question. It's not an easy response. So, I have been in contact in the last year or so with seminary formators from Dawson seminaries, where they may be more traditional than a typical Jesuit, let's say, seminary, but few of them have said the problem we have now is that our men, our young men in formation, are not really in touch with those in the pews. That is, they get their education, but then they have no pastoral experience in their formation. Their pastoral experience, maybe 1 year, but that's not enough. And so that is a problem. I think, for me, One may be progressive, one may be traditional. That said, you have to have some pastoral experience in order to be able to reach out to the other side. Men and women who may be different, who hold different views from you. And I'm not touting, or not trying, and I'm always very careful when I say this. I'm very grateful that my formation as a Jesuit required me 3 years of high school teaching. That does break a person's theology. Everything like that. When you're in front of sophomore boys and you're trying to teach Bible or ethics, they don't want to be there, and they do humiliate you. So I know that from listening to seminary formators in Dawson seminaries, they realize that is a need. That is a need. Getting their young men out there in the pews before they can ordain them. That helps. Yes?
I've heard many people, mostly women, say, if there had been women in the hierarchy, if you will, or if there had been ordained women who were part of discerning through all of this mess, which I didn't realize had been going on for as many decades as it has, as you've explained. I'm just wondering how you would respond to that. Do you think that the missing feminine part is a piece of what could redeem and give us more hope, or can you speak to that?
That's a great question. A couple of thoughts. I did, I think, allude in my conclusion there has to be a collaborative community, right? Perhaps in that collaborative, I'm referring to not just ordained members, but also lay folks, married women, who can give feedback to the hierarchy on what they should do concerning this matter. I could be wrong. I think USCCB did come to Francis to present a plan back last year concerning independent oversight of this. I think Rome said no. I think there has to be, it has to be with canon law. So there has to be a way, in my opinion, to somehow create room for independent oversight, which includes women, men who are laid to give feedback on this, to give what? To hold the hierarchy accountable. I did have a friend of mine who left the priesthood, Jesuit, who said, and he was talking about women's ordination, he was talking about married priests. He said, if you had married men in the priesthood, this would not have happened. Because they would have been more protective of young children than celibate men. Again, that's something that stays in my head after all these years. He left the priesthood about 8 years ago. This is when WASP exploded, and they got very angry. I left the priesthood. They said to me, if the Catholic Church had allowed married priests, the sexual scandals would not have ballooned to such a proportion.
Not just married priests, but women actually in there.
Yeah.
Part of it, not just giving you ideas, but in the hierarchy, so that, that they have a say. It's more, there's a lot of trust that has to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
And without us in there, I mean, part of it, I don't know how that will happen.
No, I agree. Yes.
I think clericalism sounds more like an excuse than an argument for why this happened.
Can you say more about that?
Well, it's just like it's more of a good old boy system, where the priests get together and they decide, okay, well, as an institution, we will allow this to happen, instead of actually individuals know what's right and what's wrong. as it's happening and as they witness it happening, and yet no one does anything about it.
Okay. I never thought about that in that way. Okay.
I agree with my sisters up in the front table. You talk about dramatic bias and group bias, and again, that just gives me an example of the Good Old Boy Network. Had you had diverse opinions at the table, not here we decided this and how would you like some input, I think it would be run much better. There's an excellent book by Cass Sunstein called, his label is Wiser, and he talks about the real need to have diverse groups making decisions, because the better the group is, or the better diversified the group is, the better decisions that group makes. And that, I think, is essential, and I would agree absolutely with my friends in the front table.
Okay.
So I have an almost question. I don't know how to formulate it as a question, but part of John Paul's legacy was theology of the body. And I was wondering how that factors into his approach to, I mean, it doesn't seem to at all, his approach to pedophilia in the priesthood. Or maybe he's just compartmentalizing everything. And I just was wondering what your take on his theology of the body was in all of this.
You realize that I left out beyond the body.
Oh, I realized that.
Yeah. I left it out because to be honest, I've known men and women who have been drawn to the other body. And I've known men and women who have been like, no, this is utterly ridiculous. I don't buy this, right? And I don't have an informed opinion on where to go with that. That said, does it inform how he did not act or act on this? I haven't thought about that. I mean, I left it out because I know that it is a loaded topic.
That's why I give it to you.
My question or concern, issue, is kind of a follow-up to Mary in the front there, who asked about the integrity of these priests that were pedophiles, and why they did not have, why their own integrity was not really called into question in terms of consequences. And I think that, for me, that goes so much further, because the bishops got to be the judge, and many of them were complicit in that type of behavior themselves, if not with young men, with their secretaries, housekeepers, somewhere along the line, taking babies and helping them be adopted, just so many issues. And so we have the USCCB trying to decide what to do about all of this with these bishops there. I have no trust in any bishop that ever moved a priest from one location to another. That doesn't leave many. The string that I'm hanging by is unraveling rapidly.
I'm not a big fan. So to add to your comment, I'm not a fan of now, especially with recent scandals concerning bishops who've done bad things, that who's policing these bishops? Other bishops. And so it doesn't help. There's no, so to your point, a lot of men and women are saying, how can we trust bishops to police other bishops? You know, it's as if basically, someone said over here, it's still part of that good old boy network. Yes.
Could you clarify something for me that that I thought you said? I thought you said Jesus established the hierarchy with the bishops, etc. When did he do that?
That is a traditional take, that Jesus established a church that had a hierarchy with the apostles. So, I mean, that's
See, I don't believe that. I think that's kind of making something up to justify something that is present today.
I would say, like, for example, in the Episcopal or Anglican Church, there's a hierarchy. Within
Oh, I know.
There's a hierarchy. So there is an element of hierarchy. The question is, how do you exercise that authority? Right?
Right. I also don't believe that Jesus established ordination. And, you know, what we have today is not what, I don't know what was in his mind. I don't think it's what we have today. But, you know, the other thing that I find really disturbing is the speed with which John Paul was canonized. And I don't understand that. I realize all of us are saints, all of us are sinners. But with so much evidence, I think his canonization caused much more angst within Catholicism.
To that point, I wish there was a slower process. I wish it was not canonized, well, it's 5 years after his death, right? It was very quick. No, I'm not defending the hierarchy. I mean, there were, after his death, there were crowds of people outside St. Peter's chanting Santo Subito, Santo Subito. On that note, I would like for us to stop canonizing popes.
So would I.
As a person who likes to do theological saints, I think we should start canonizing married couples. I mean, on a tangential note here, there's a movie coming out, we're speaking of a movie, especially with the Grace of God, which is, I'm told, a very difficult movie about the sexualist crisis in France. But in terms of, I think, movies about heroic saints and martyrs, if you're familiar with the director, Terrence Malick, he's come with a movie from to be released in the United States in 2008, I'm sorry, December 8th, called A Hidden Life, on the martyrdom of Franz Jägerstatter, an Austrian man who was beheaded by the Nazis. You know, he was beatified by Benedict back in 2009. His wife was still alive when Benedict beatified Franz Jägerstatter. In my opinion, his wife now has passed away back in 2014. In my opinion, Francesca should also be beatified because she not only turned his life around, that is, she gave him the courage, the hope, and the commission to be a martyr. So, if the church really believes in Gaudium Spes and the aspirations of the Second Vatican Council, they should start canonizing married couples and stop canonizing popes. There it is.
Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you very much, Father Wayne. And thanks to you all for coming out on a very chilly evening. It's always very good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.